Welcome to another episode of the Business Speed Podcast. I'm Steve Breitenstein here with Nick Bratton. We are getting to this episode here right in time for Mardi Gras, which is super exciting for Nick down in New Orleans. He was just kind of talking me through what the schedule is around the facility and just in New Orleans in general during this time of year. So Nick, you want to give our viewers a little bit insights into what your schedule is like these days when Mardi Gras, which is not just a day, it's not just a week. How long is this really taking on a life of its own?
Yeah, well, Mardi Gras down here it's actually a season. You get done with Christmas and literally everything is focused on Mardi Gras. I think the Epiphany is like the 5th or 6th day of the year. And then everything from then until Ash Wednesday is all about Mardi Gras. And parades start almost immediately, but really there's about a 10-day segment right now that is, the city is just enthralled by this. So I'm a professor at Tulane. And when I went to campus last Wednesday night, I had to actually change my route and where I normally park just so that I could actually get to class. And my students were not happy that we were having class on an evening that a parade was occurring right outside our windows. And so, entire areas of the city are going to be shut down for periods at a time. There are, like I said, parades every night, and a parade will take 4 or 5 hours at a time. Most people show up 2 or 3 hours beforehand in order to mark their spot. But yeah, I mean, the city is really, it is just enthralled by this. Tomorrow will be Mardi Gras. It works out perfectly for me because actually tomorrow is my 35th birthday too. So,
Hey, happy birthday.
I get the day off. But yeah, it's all businesses will close down unless you're a national brand. You're not open for the day. Kids are out of school for all of this week, even though Mardi Gras is on Tuesday, all of this week and half of last week. And so, yeah, it's definitely different. It's funny, talking to our clients, talking to our kids, and people asking, will you guys be open? Will you guys, still be around this week? And like, you guys do understand that this is the only city in the entire world that celebrates this, right? This is not an actual holiday.
Yeah.
But yeah, it definitely jacks with our life and with my financial planning for about 10 days and throws us off. But next week we'll jump back into it.
I love it. See, I've never experienced a situation like that, a unique holiday for us up in Chicago. We don't have those.
Yeah, be glad you don't. It's funny. Anytime I go to the bank for, any type of work, any type of investing, they're like, well, we need your financial planning. Like, how do I plan for this? How do I plan for a fake holiday that lands at any point in February or March, depending on the year? That's tough to plan for.
Without a doubt. Now, I know last time on the podcast, our episode, we touched on block training and how we use that with our athletes, especially like our track athletes as they're getting closer to season, further away from season, whether they're young and maybe don't even use blocks. Is there a benefit to blocks? What's that go-to setup? And we said we wanted to elaborate that on this episode of the podcast because it's something that so many athletes struggle with. And it's a difficult concept for coaches in a large group training atmosphere to really give specific coaching points to. Sometimes they're just getting kids to just survive their starts. But in our space, we're able to spend a little bit more time and a little more specificity for any of our athletes. And I know we wanted to talk about more specifically some of the setup pieces. And I know we're going to touch on a little bit of the technique coming out too. But Nick, I know from your past, what are some of those more intricate details of someone who's setting up in the blocks?
Yeah, it depends on where you want to start. But there are a lot of different philosophies out there. So I'll talk about a couple of things that, basically what happens is we'll show up to the Olympics like we will this year. Bahamas, Jamaica, they will show up with a technique that no one else has seen before. And for the next 4 years, we'll try and figure it out. And then we'll do the same thing in 2028 when we show up. And so, a couple of these things, something as simple as hand width, your hand width when you set up in the blocks. You'll get some individuals who have longer arms. I've got a girl who's 13 years old and she stands at 6'2". Most athletes I coach to put their hands right at shoulder width. I want their hands just wide enough that they can squeeze through there. For her, that puts her too high up off the track, and she ends up, kind of sailing out of the blocks. And so we go with a wider hand positioning so that we can put her shoulders closer to the ground. And again, a lot of these things you learn it, you understand it not by their setup position, but by what happens based on the setup. What happens when they come out of the blocks? I don't know that she's going to rise too quickly until she actually rises too quickly. And so, just looking at that, looking at our hip position in relation to our shoulders. For me, with most of our athletes, I want their hips about 2-3 inches above their shoulders. But that also depends on what it does to the lower limb. We talked a little bit about proportions last week. And for some of my athletes with longer torsos, shorter lower extremities, when they bring their hips 2 inches above their shoulders, their tibia is too vertical. And so, when we set up, I want the tibia of the back foot to be either parallel or about 10 degrees above parallel to the ground. And so that back tibia should not have a lot of elevation to it. The front tibia is going to have a little bit more. It's going to come closer to about 45 degrees, a little bit less, maybe 35 to 40. But this is all going to be dependent on how high the hips come up. Now, before I ever get to that, we talked about hand width. The other piece is where the shoulders are in relation to the hands. So we spend a lot of time helping our athletes to get comfortable bringing their shoulders forward of their hands. And so for me, their shoulders should be, again, depending on their length, anywhere from 2 to 4. Some of our taller guys will get 5 inches out in front of their hands. If they're a little bit taller, they've got a little bit thicker back end, and they can keep their feet down in the pedals, then we're going to get their shoulders as far forward as we can. Because when I coach block starts, my initial cue is sweep the hands. It has nothing to do with the feet. It's sweep the hands. Because if we can get the hands sweeping in opposite directions, one, it means that we're not pulling them up and shrugging out of the blocks. But two, we're already going to get that forward momentum coming forward. And one thing that we're going to talk about here in a minute is hip flexor or hip flexion frequency. And this is something that I want to get your input on. But one of the ways that I can make sure that we engage really explosive first steps is if we have our momentum falling forward and we're trying to catch up to it. And so that's what I want. I want that falling forward position. Now, a couple of other things that have come out of, the 2016, 2020 Olympics that have been big lately are, one, a toe drag coming out of the blocks. And so we use this a lot. I would say about 65% of our athletes would use a toe drag, especially if they were multi-sport athletes and then they became a track athlete and they got used to a really high heel stride or reciprocal movement as they brought their foot through, just teaching them to keep the foot closer to the ground before they get into that next push. Steve, this is something that I have an internal struggle with, and I know you and I talk about this often, is force application. The weight room side of us says that it's all about force application. The track side of us says that it may not be all about that. And so, I'm always arguing with myself, are we getting enough knee drive in order to apply enough force into the ground? Are we getting too much knee drive to where we're creating too much time in between steps and we're not creating enough of a contact? One of the things that you and I had talked about off air last week was how much push do we get out of each degree of hip flexion? And what I mean by that is if I bring my hip to 75 degrees of hip flexion, how much force output am I getting? If I bring my hip to 90 degrees of hip flexion and then drive back, how much force output am I getting? But same thing with hip extension. Do we really need to get to triple extension every time? Are the last 15 degrees of triple extension at the hip, at the knee, at the ankle really creating as much push as the first 75 degrees are? Or is it just terminal at that point? Are we just, maintaining our momentum? And this is something that, again, I think we'll dive into a little bit here in a minute. But so using that toe drag to keep a low reciprocation over the track. And then the last piece too is, we see a lot of sprinters who are setting up with their toes off the track now. And this is something that we haven't really learned yet. We haven't really figured out. Again, this is something that occurred around the 2020 Olympics. We saw A lot of the Central American countries setting up with their shoes about an inch, inch and a half up on the block. There's a lot of hypotheses here, whether it's creating a little more flight time, whether it's forcing us to be more intentional about that toe drag and bring the foot down before we go into that hip flexion. Again, there are several rhyme and reasons that we are philosophizing this, but suffice it to say, we're always looking for some new things in order to create a little more drive out of that block start.
Yeah, and that drive that's really what we're talking about through all of this. Is when we say drive, it's not necessarily your head coming out, it's not necessarily your shoulders coming out, it's that hip projection that allows you to kind of get into a smooth running technique. Because we've seen probably hundreds, if not thousands, of starts where someone really drives their head and shoulders forward and they stumble. Mm-hmm. Or we've seen someone really drive their knee through, but they actually raise up out of it because they projected and they drove their knee. But really getting that like snap of the hips, that if you're measuring where their hips start to where their hips are on the next ground contact to where their hips are on the next ground contact, you can't really cheat that. Different if you're measuring your step length, which I know I've seen coaches do sometimes for athletes. That's like a motivator to say like, oh, I want you to step here. This is where I want your foot to strike. But you can cheat that by just overreaching a little bit. What have you seen for athletes that have a tendency to set up a little bit too far back with their shoulders relative to their hands? Is that going to equal that they're always coming up early, or just that it's not really a smooth start? Where have you seen? So you're saying that you're trying to get them to maybe like 2 to 4 inches out in front of their hands with their shoulders.
Well, so sometimes we'll see them come up a little bit too early, but the biggest thing that I see is they have slow reactions. They are sitting back and they are trying to initiate that movement, that push based on when they hear the gun. And again, my cue for my athletes is when you hear the gun, we sweep the hands, because that immediately causes that forward momentum. And so we have to drive out in order to catch up with the rest of our body. And so the biggest thing that I see is, they're just slow. They're slow. They're not powerful. They're not able to really drive out. And it typically our weight shift isn't equal. I believe that when we're pushing out, we're pushing off both blocks. Too often we see athletes that are just pushing off that front block. And so if we can get the weight forward a little bit more, we end up getting a little more engagement off that back block, because we're not just sitting on the front leg. And that's what ends up happening. You sit the hips back and all the weight sits on that front leg because it's a close one. Mm-hmm. And so, we're just sitting there and we have a slow, less reactive start just because of where the weight is distributed.
Yeah. Do you have any little drills that you kind of like to encourage your athletes to feel that pressure of both feet on that first movement out? Do you like to do any one-step things out of the blocks, or do you like to have them more getting a rhythm of 3 to 5 steps? Because I know there's differentiating debates on, is focusing on one step worth it, or is that just teach bad habits? And I know the blocks, it definitely can mess with a rhythm for coming out.
Yeah. I mean, I like to do everything in a standing position first. And so we'll do a lot of, explosive step ups, have our athletes set up, with a box under 1 foot and focus on, pushing off both feet, get to a point where you have good balance on both feet, pushing off both feet, but understanding what that true extension should feel like. And so we'll start there, and then we can move into, we do a lot of single leg starts, and so again, understanding how do we take what we did on that explosive step up, move it into an actual running position. And then, I don't really go any shorter than 3 steps, just because I feel like when they do 1 step, they're so worried about stopping or slowing themselves down that they don't understand how the 2 steps should relate, how the first 2 steps should relate. And so, the shortest that I'll go is 3. That way we can at least get the initial push out of the blocks, the initial push off your first foot. So for me, my right foot, and then what it feels like to go from right to left. And that's what I want to feel. I want to feel block under left, right, left. Or if you're, the other side, block under right, left, right. So feel what that engagement is. Because again, when we're talking about projection is all about how do we get to the next stride. Yeah. Well, if we're not actually landing the next stride, then all we're doing is working deceleration. We're working a hop to a stop. And so I want them to be able to feel the projection and feel what that next foot contact should be like, not directly under the body, but actually driving back and learning how to project through the second step, through the third step, through the fourth step, because we're continuing to get that drive out. It's not just that first step that we want pushing us down the track.
Yeah. And I mean, that brings us right into what you touched on earlier, is the relationship of force and frequency in those next steps. And this is, like you said, this is always an internal challenge for us, is because to think about force, you obviously will just gravitate towards, well, that'll help us project further. We're covering more ground each stride. So that is an area that we should be working on. And we've always seen those athletes that kind of spin their wheels and we're like, well, that doesn't look quite right. Yeah, their legs are moving really quickly, but they're not really covering much ground. And it's one of the easier things to work on, honestly, is let's just try to get a little bit stronger, produce a little bit more force, slow down a little bit, spend a little bit more time on the ground, and that'll help us run faster. The challenge that I see now visually all the time is just too slow to get front side, and we're not getting those hips moving quick enough. So in this situation, can you describe a little bit of maybe what is ideal or what you're trying to work on to try and get to that more of a frequency side of it?
Yeah. I'm watching and listening for something specific. There is a cadence that I want to hear as they're coming out of the blocks. And oftentimes, even when we are coaching in the facility, I will also clap out that cadence. I won't do it for our listeners because I don't want to destroy their ears, but I want them to hear like what that cadence should sound like and the transition of the cadence too, so that they understand that it's not just step, 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 step. Like there is an actual transition. And so as you're coming out, it's step, 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 and so it's not that the steps are getting slower. It's that we have more distance in between each one. But also helping them understand that, yes, we are projecting out. And when we do something like a sled bounding or a bounding exercise, that may mean that there is additional time in between every step. But when you get into that forward position, even though you're producing the same amount of force, the steps are going to be much more rapid because, again, we're falling and we have to catch that fall. And so, helping them understand what that should sound like. Now, as far as, what I'm looking for, the biggest thing that I'm looking for is, what do the contacts look like? Yeah. Where are we in relationship to the body? How are we getting back to front side? Like you talked about, sometimes we have athletes that are slow to get to front side. And so, one of the things that we do a lot of is just hip flexor strengthening exercises. I know a couple of episodes back, I don't remember which one, we talked about some of the hip flexor drills that we do on our linear speed day warm-ups, things like leg swings, things like banded knee drives at the wall. We also put some videos up on our YouTube as well, some of our YouTube shorts, just showing some of our exercises. And so, for me, one of the things, because of the age group that we work with, they're so young and they're growing so quickly. And when they grow, the limb becomes heavier. They have got to be stronger in order to have any type of speed with that contraction. They may be strong enough to complete the contraction, but they're not strong enough to do it quickly. Yeah. And so just making sure that they have adequate strength to be able to do that explosively. And so we will do that before our warm-ups. And just, having a time that's designated to strengthening the hip flexors.
Yeah. I think one of my favorites for just working on that front side frequency is just your simple banded A run variations, but not completely vertical necessarily. It's giving them different angles that they're going to be trying to maintain, or a slow rise. And I know that there's a video of me doing that on our YouTube as well, but it's where you kind of come out in that 40 to 45 degree and in every step just gradually coming up in front of yourself, but really challenging the frequency of that front side position and just getting that nervous system. As Nick is expressing, like there's a component of being strong enough to do it. And then there's another piece of, is my nervous system wired to do it quickly enough as well? And it's hard to say it's one versus the other. So let's train both. Let's get them stronger, and let's also challenge how fast can they get that foot up in front of themselves. There's always going to be an opportunity for those to help. And when Nick was saying, like, how do I evaluate if they are going fast enough? A lot of times for me, it comes down to how the foot is striking the ground. when we view an athlete at the point of ground contact, you can see if they are catching their weight. Were they striking to actually produce force and project themselves forward? Were they a little bit slow? Were they kind of maybe caught themselves a little bit and the heel drops after the moment of contact? And you can have all these different things that you're kind of seeing and then evaluating to say, like, well, what was the cause of that? Is it because they're weak in their lower leg? Is it because they need more soleus development? Do they need more plyometric development? Were they just too slow to get to front side so that at the point where they hit the ground, they were still catching? They weren't able to be in a position to produce force. And all of those kind of go into our evaluation to say, this is something they need to work on to help with this.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So Steve, you talk about, the neural piece.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you guys do that are less about the strength or the force, but more about like, how do we train speed? How do we get them to move faster than what they believe they can move?
Yeah. Honestly, foundationally, it's the A run variations.
Mm-hmm.
I always tell my guys when I'm working with them, we're striving to get 4 to 5 ground contacts per second when we're doing these A runs without minimizing the range of motion, because that's how many strides we need to cover if we want to run a sub 1 flying 10. We're going to take 4 to 5 strides. If we can't move our legs fast enough to do that, we're never going to run a sub 1. So that would be my first one. The second one would be some of those low-level hop variations where we're doing not like a single leg bound necessarily, but just working on that slight kind of popping sensation to work on that rhythm of, I got to get hip flexion, but then I have to land in a position to create force again to pop. I can't just land to land. And I think that those are the ones that really challenge the nervous system, where you're trying to create some sort of movement that has rhythm to it. Anytime where it's kind of like a 1 rep activity, it doesn't feel like it's quite challenging the neural system the same way as when you're doing something that requires rhythm, when it's a circular type pattern similar to sprinting.
Yeah. Yeah. We do a lot of fast leg drills, which I really like. I think from a rhythm standpoint, those are really good. But I'm going to throw a couple ideas at you here, and I want you to try and poke a hole in them. So listeners, as you know, we are students of this as much as we are trying to share our thoughts and ideas. And so you're going to go inside the mind of Nick and Steve for a second here. So what are your thoughts on, so I'm going to explain the setup for a second here. You're laying on your stomach on a physio ball or yoga ball, or you're laying on a box that has a physio ball or yoga ball under it. Mm-hmm. You flex the knees to 90 degrees, or you flex the hips to 90 degrees, knees to 90 degrees, and you're basically punching your knees into the physio ball. Yeah. So again, you're laying on it, and it's just a quick in and out on the physio ball. You're never getting into full extension, but all it is just 5 to 10 degrees of punching into the ball and almost bouncing back out of it.
Yeah. These drills, to me, there's a part of me at first that always goes, that can't possibly have benefit. That's like a deep-seated part of just like, there's no way. But then I always pause. I'm like, but if I'm truly just training my nervous system to contract and relax as rapidly as possible, there's a couple coaches that's kind of their whole system. And some of it is completely wild, and some of it makes me pause and go, maybe that does have validity. And like that, I've seen some where they're kind of hanging from a bar and they're doing just wild leg flexion. It's just as crazy as possible. And I think there's always value to say you're challenging your body to create a different rhythm of contract, relax than it's used to. And anytime you can push outside of your comfort zone on that, you're going to challenge your body's way to kind of learn and adapt. And it's got to have benefit, especially if it's not dangerous.
Right. Right. Because similarly, I also think about, we've seen these drills where you're at a rack, you put, say like a green super band around the hooks, and normally you're lying on your back and you're basically doing like the tantrum kicks or the flutter kicks in the band. But conversely, flip them over and put them in a push-up position. Yeah. So put them in a push-up position and then do those flutter kicks or do those tantrum kicks. And again, it's a small range of motion, but like you're talking about, it's that very, very quick contract, relax. And now you're doing it in more of an extended position, but just learning how to quickly engage those movements.
Yeah, I think all those ones, it's hard to say like this is the money one because they seem to all have some sort of value, you know? And then just
Mm-hmm.
having like one of the ones that we did a bunch recently was standing with a band that's about knee height and then having to go thigh underneath it into flexion and then doing switches and just trying to keep that band now up at waist height during that switch activity. You can do the switches as rapidly as you want, do double switches. Same idea as kind of the tantrum type feel. But again, it's a small degree of challenge, but it's just
Mm-hmm.
challenging that end range is where you're trying to spend some time at. And it's those ones that you kind of miss in most of the other exercises is you're kind of going through a big full range of motion, spend a lot of work on the ground contact piece, but maybe there's value to just working this top part of that hip flexion.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Okay.
I mean, it'd be
I'm
fun to just kind of post and find the most creative versions and just see like polling it saying, does this have value or not? Just curious. Like, let's have a
yeah.
discussion about this one has value. This one doesn't seem to have value. Because I know I've
Yeah.
come across dozens of ones that seem like that's crazy, but then if you try it, you're like, nah, I kind of like the feel of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is something I'm going to play with a little bit, just because there are times where you work with an athlete for a couple of years on end, and it's like, okay, I've squeezed a lot out of this orange here. How do I get the last drop out?
Yeah.
What is it? I've got a girl that I'm working with right now that, she's been with me for, I mean, since I opened 7 years now. And a phenomenal track athlete, made it to state finals the last 2 years. She's a junior right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, what is it going to take to get her to win state? What is it going to take to get, because she has the drive, she has the desire. And for me, it's like, okay, it's not another set of squats. It's not another set of fly tens. It's not
Mm-hmm.
it is going to be something else because again, we've done that for years on end and she's seen great benefit, but I can see the benefit plateau. And so what is the last bit that we can get out of this?
And because you like a drill for an individual like that, it doesn't mean you're programming that at scale
No.
for a
Right.
team. It's not something you would do in a weight room setting with 20 people. But there are different things that you do with an individual that you get creative with just to solve a specific problem they're running into. Maybe there's a specific cue that you're offering just that person, but that doesn't mean it's a global thing that you're going to scale.
Right. Right.
And I think this
All
week
right. Well,
we'll definitely touch on a few
that's
of
our
those.
homework.
Yeah, for
Yes.
sure.
All right. Well, Steve, I know we have kind of hinted at, maybe talked about it a little bit, but you recently went through a big move. You've been working with Jeremy Boone for a while now, and you are kind of going all in and doing a little bit more from a leadership standpoint. And so, I think I would like to, and I'd like for our listeners to kind of hear what you do, what you're going into, what this next phase is going to be like. Obviously, still doing a lot of coaching, but now part of your coaching is going to be to a different group about some different topics. And so, if you could just share a little bit more on what this next step looks like.
Yeah, so the start of February was my end at TCBOOST, which I've been a part of for 12 years. And over the last 4.5 years, I've been able to work in a limited capacity with Jeremy Boone, and what we call WinningLeader is the company that offers leadership training, leadership development, and it's scaling in a variety of levels to say that it is originally was a way to kind of work with athletes in some of their decision making and really help their return from injuries, then maximize performance. And the evolution of it kept going where, well, this seems to be helpful in all capacities, not just athletes. So then working with coaches, working with athletic directors, GMs, it just kept kind of scaling its way up into some of these corporate level positions. And corporations are always looking to get better at leadership in a time where there is a lot of movement career wise from individuals. There's a different style of leadership as far as you have millennial employees that don't respond to maybe your typical leadership styles. Post COVID, There's a lot of agility that's needed from leadership to be able to really help their employees and their teams really thrive. And so this year is offering an opportunity for me to just go full time because of the demand. It's increased. A few of the things that, always in the small business entrepreneurial space that we work in is, hey, if these couple things hit, we might have to hire somebody, or if these things hit, you may have to leave where you're at right now and go full time into this. And that kind of happened right at the new year. And so we'll be fortunate enough to be working with a couple corporations that are scaling leadership from their CEO level down, as well as some exciting things that we're hoping to do with the ground floor of athletes in the high school setting, and scaling all the way in between there. So I'm going to be working with individuals kind of one-on-one, taking them through the Winning Leader leadership development curriculum, going off-site and traveling a little bit to actually be in person at some of these facilities, and then being a point of contact online, because a lot of the curriculum piece, the content piece, is now available on our platform. So you don't have to just go through a phone call or be there in person to go through this. You're able to kind of go through the content and then talk with me weekly, bi-weekly, to provide context for kind of the situations and how to apply it, different strategies as far as taking your leadership to the next level.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think it's a great opportunity for you. One thing that I wanted to make sure that I shared with our listeners is, obviously Steve is not there. The business of speed is not going anywhere. We will continue to be here. But one thing that I hope that this kind of shows is just the amount of just insight that Steve brings from a leadership standpoint. I know that I rely on him heavily with my own group, with my own leadership styles. And so, he is just a wealth of knowledge and information. And obviously, outside of coaching, there are C-suite and entire companies that are coming to him and to Jeremy for what they do. And so, I hope that you guys really understand and take advantage of what you're able to pick up in each episode from, what they do with an entire business. And you're able to get 10, 15-minute snippets of it. And so, I'm excited to hear what's gonna go on. I have loved watching this evolution, and very cool to be on the sidelines and see what's happening.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that, Nick. And it is,
Yeah.
it's been a piece of, I appreciate Nick over these years, kind of his insights into how BSP started, and for me to build a little bit of belief in what I can do outside of a facility. And I'm hoping that we can bring some of those insights as well, because not only will I be working with Winning Leader, but there will be some small pieces I'm coaching now as an entity, as we've talked about over the years, where you don't have to have a facility to make an impact with athletes. And I'll be out of 3 or 4 different locations doing some speed work still with teams and individuals. And I hope to bring as many of the insights as that journey of struggle and successes go as well. Just providing a different lens, which I'm excited to, for our listeners and for those coaches that are in a situation right now where they're unsure of the future of that tenure, and to say I've spent 10 years plus somewhere. Am I okay to leave that situation? Can I go off, or do I just need to finish this thing off and see where it goes? 12 years, long time in one space for me. And it definitely was a bit of a gamble, and there were different emotions along the way as far as what was going to be coming out of this. But I am more excited than ever to kind of take this journey on.
Yeah. And it, like we talked about just a second ago, you and I live this. We don't just get on here and preach from a soapbox. We live this stuff each and every day, whether it's, the business side, the leadership side, or even the speed training. Steve, I wanted to wrap up a little bit here with just, obviously you're making a move. 2 episodes ago, we talked about some other well-known coaches who have made some moves from, high school to the private sector training. I have my own philosophy on, the development of a career as someone who started out in physical therapy and then got into managing a facility and then the NBA, and now was in a high school for 5 years and now back in a private facility. I have my own philosophy and what I teach my coaches and my interns. But, kind of what's your thought process here? What has been going through your mind? Give us an idea of kind of how you have gone about kind of reconciling with yourself, 12 years as a sports performance coach, and now, doing something a little bit different, but still coaching. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. There were a lot of different directions that my career could have gone based on opportunities that have come my way. And early on, I was fortunate enough before I even had the guidance that like I should have been doing this. I said, I don't want to just be coaching forever. I want to be able to add value beyond being in front of an athlete, a team. I want to add more. Part of why business of speed is a thing. Nick and I both agree on that part. And I always said I wanted to do some sort of consulting, speaking, writing, whatever it was. I just knew that I wanted to do enough while I was coaching that I would have value beyond that. And so that was kind of what I saw happening after I went through leadership development, mentorship with Jeremy 7.5 years ago or so, was that, oh man, this is really neat. Like this is something I could really see myself doing. Maybe not the exact same thing at that time. I didn't know that 7 years later I would be doing it full time, but something in this realm that's still coaching and helping others achieve something, but it's not necessarily just me one-on-one for an hour or 5-on-1 for an hour. There's more to it. And along the way, that has always been my guide for what I wanted to be doing next, or what I was going to kind of gravitate towards or take a chance on, was it had to be moving me in that direction. I've been offered a number of coaching positions over the years that they were going to be coaching again. And so it always felt like it was lateral. It didn't really matter that it was maybe a few dollars more here or there. I wanted to make sure that I was moving in the direction that I said I wanted to be moving towards, and that I knew I needed to get to eventually. And so with this piece, it was that there is no box on it, which I gravitate towards. I love having no box around what my job is. I like just a title that kind of is loose as well. And then you kind of make it what you want. And there's no ceiling on what you can do, which I love. And I have one person I answer to, and that's Jeremy. And the rest is, man, just go make some stuff happen. I love that. And I love the fact that I don't have a staff right now. I have me, myself, and I. And that's kind of fun too, because I haven't had that for a while either. And Nick's laughing because I know there's so many times where there's just headaches for us that come with leading a team. Like there's stuff that goes on that if you're the leader, you have to take that on and say, well, I'm going to be responsible for that. That wasn't my problem, but I'm going to take it on because we got to keep moving forward. So for me to not have that right now is weird. It's very strange because it's been 10 years since that's been the case. But that's been a part of my thought process, was understanding kind of the direction I wanted to go and understanding if these opportunities along the way were in fact bringing me closer to that or not, and being more intentional now later in my career than I was early to say like, yeah, this definitely is taking me somewhere. I got to take a chance on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's great. One of the things that I try and get across to, my interns, my young coaches, even my students at Tulane. I was having a conversation last Wednesday night with a student about this. You come out of school and you're so dead set on one job, and you go and you work toward that job or in that position. And you feel like because you dedicated so much time, so much money toward it, that's what you have to do. And that's what you're going to do until you retire. It was probably a decade ago that I started thinking about my career in a little bit of different light, and realizing that there are going to be phases of my professional career. There was a phase where I was in Indy and running a facility, and there was a phase where I was in the NBA, in a phase where I was in high school. And for one reason or another, there was always a reason why that phase needed to end. Yeah. Whether it was because I was getting married, or because I was having a child and I needed to be home more, or, I wanted more flexibility. And, there will be people, and Steve, I know you've come up against this too, that will say, well, why aren't you in professional athletics? Yeah. I know that you were there, or I know you've had an opportunity to be there, or I know because it's not right for me right now. Yeah. And that's one thing that I think that we have to understand is ultimately, and I know you and I both believe this, we're husbands and fathers first. And that is our first calling. And then after that, we have our career. Yeah. And so, there will be a day where I may be back in professional athletics. There may be a day where you're in professional athletics. And if we feel like we're ready for that, we have to make a few phone calls and we can make that happen.
Yeah.
But it may not be the perfect time for us right now. When my daughter goes off and graduates and my wife is retired, maybe a great time for us to go and do that. But right now, it's just not a good fit for us. And I think that sometimes when we're young, we get so caught up in, I have to go get this position. I have to be there. That's where I want to be. Well, it may not be the right point in your life to be there, because I can tell you from experience, if you get married and you get ready to start having kids and you get to your dream position, that probably is not the best position for your family. And you're going to have to make a really difficult decision on whether you stay in that position because you work so hard to get there, or you decide to walk away from it because you want to focus on your family. And so, all that to say, I think that sometimes we look at our career in the wrong way, and we need to understand that there are going to be phases, there are going to be seasons to it, and doesn't mean that that's where you're stuck. There's always a number of things that you can do from there, but just understand that you need to decide what's going to fit your life the best.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Nick. Just not necessarily having the blinders on, being aware of just what's going on around you, who's important to you in this moment. There's going to be opportunities like crazy. Early on, it's hard to be patient too, where you feel like you have to get to that position within 5 years. That it's not the case. And there's so much time to reach these levels and to add value at all these different stops along the way in this profession or any other. There's such a rush to get to the top or get to perceived to the top, but you're going to miss out on a lot of enjoyment along the way. So I think those are great points to end it on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, congratulations, Steve. Can't wait to hear some of the stories on that, and just, continue to gain your insight from a leadership standpoint.